Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse, but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be all about the size and spacing requirements for the trees that you're going to be placing in your permaculture food forest project. Now we're going to be discussing how to plan ahead for the growth of the trees that you're planting, as well as what to do once those trees outgrow the space that you have set aside for them. Now, when you go down to the garden center or nursery to purchase your fruit trees, you'll be given a choice, oftentimes, of purchasing dwarf-sized trees or standard-sized trees. I never purchase dwarf-sized trees, and I'll explain a little bit of why that is in this video. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is why dwarf trees even exist in the first place. When you grow fruit, say you grow it from a seed, and you grow thousands of trees, well, some of those trees are going to have fruit that is the size of a marble and hard as a rock. Other trees might have fruit that's really big, but really terrible tasting. And so in order to maintain a standard type of fruit that everybody wants, we graft. Grafting is when you take those 1,000 trees that produce all those different things, and when they are very, very young, you go to a known variety and you cut limbs off, hundreds of limbs, and you cut them into a shape so that they stick down into the trunks of those little rootstock trees. That way, when the tree gets mature, it'll produce the kind of fruit you want. There isn't any question about what's going to be grown. And another problem with growing trees from seeds is that a lot of trees have to be 10, 15 years old before they produce fruit, whereas a grafted tree is not, because a grafted limb from a 10-year-old tree will produce fruit even if it's on a 1-year-old rootstock. So there's the reasons for that. Now, in experiments with rootstocks, growers have come to understand that certain rootstocks restrict the nutrients necessary for the tree's growth. It is possible that those rootstocks do not restrict the nutrients necessary to produce fruit, but I've never seen a dwarf-sized tree produce the amount of fruit for tree size as a full-size tree. In other words, you can get pear trees that the limbs will break off from having too many pears. Every dwarf-sized tree I've seen usually has like one piece of fruit on a limb. They're not a good tree to grow for food. They may be for ornamental purposes, but not for food. For food, you want a big tree. And another thing about a dwarf tree is if later you decide you want a big tree, there's nothing you can do. That tree is going to be dwarf forever no matter what. But if you have a big tree, and later on you decide you want a dwarf tree, well, you can't get a dwarf tree, but you can take and cut that big tree down to the size you want, and it'll still live. Most trees do very well with pruning. We're going to show you right now how I'm pruning these trees. And the trees I've got really shouldn't be pruned because these are fig trees. If you've seen any of my fig videos, then you know I get lots of figs. But I've come to learn that when the trees get really, really, really big, that I can't reach the tops. But I also have learned that squirrels and raccoons won't eat the fruit near the bottom. They want to eat the fruit that's up there where they're safe from me. So when my trees are small, the raccoons and squirrels will eat all of my fruit and I don't get any. But when my trees are tall, they're just eating the stuff that's out of my reach, which is good. That's a good system. The problem I've run into is recently the insurance company wanted to take pictures of my house and they couldn't do it because the house was covered by too much bushes, these fruit trees, and in particular the figs. So I had to prune my fig trees for the insurance companies, but these I didn't have to prune. But I'm going to go ahead and prune them now simply because I want a little bit more light to get to the ground below the fig trees. I've got taro planted in here, and taro like shade, but they don't like being in total darkness. Something you need to keep in mind with these fruit trees while you're pruning them is that they are living things, and just like other living things such as animals and humans, you want to do as little damage as possible so that the tree can recover as quickly and as best it can. Now, if you're cutting away at this thing, every place you cut is a place where disease or infection can get into the tree, and so you want your cuts to be smooth. And you can't get out of making cuts if you have to prune from trees, but you don't want to make a cut that's jagged and has crevices and such in it where disease can hide. So you're always going to want to use pruners or loppers. This particular kind is a simple bypass lopper. If you notice, it's got a holding edge here on a handle and a cutting edge on the handle. And as you're shutting it down, the blade is actually going past your holding edge. That's why it's called a bypass lopper. Another kind that you need to be aware of is what's called an anvil lopper, where you have the holding edge is flat, and then the blade comes down right on top of that flat. Those will not cut live trees very well at all. They're designed for dry wood. I personally have never found any reason to own a pair of anvil loppers. And in fact, I think if you go to Lowe's or Sears or Walmart and purchase your loppers, in general, you're not even going to see them on the shelf because they are so useless to the average person. But if you purchase your loppers online, just be aware that they're there, and that's not what you want. Now, the ones I showed you are simple because the handles are connected directly to the holding end and the blade. But on these, there's a gearing mechanism. And the reason that's there is to make your work a whole lot easier. That great big pair of loppers I just held up will hold a limb this big, but you'll have a very difficult time cutting anything any bigger than that. These will cut a whole lot more. Now, the handles are shorter, but at the same time, the leverage isn't coming from the handles, it's coming from this gearing system. Another kind of gearing system or leverage maker is in these Fiskars. They're both Fiskars, and as it says, it cuts 2 times easier because that little lever is where you're getting your leverage. So that's another good kind. And I cannot tell you a benefit of one over the other. The gearing system and the levering system both work wonderfully for me. I have no problem with either one. Some limbs are going to be too big to prune with loppers. In such instances, you're going to want to use a saw, and you can't use a regular household saw that's used for cutting 2x4s. Once again, the cutting edge on a standard house saw is designed for dry wood, not live wood. With live wood, you got to have an edge more like this. I've got a little cover on here that keeps me from cutting myself when I'm messing with this thing, you know, on the shelf. But I've left it on there because that orange, it seems to make it easier to see. Hopefully you can see the kind of teeth that are on this. And this, I don't know that this is actually designed for cutting green wood, but I purchased it from Harbor Freight for that purpose, and it works fine. I've used it a couple of times and cuts right through stuff, and it causes a little bit of damage. But like when you're cutting with loppers, there's never any residue. You don't have powder falling off or anything like that. With a saw, if you've ever used one, you know that sawdust comes off. Now, something you never want to use unless you absolutely have to is a chainsaw. Now, this is a battery-powered chainsaw, but it works the same way as a regular gasoline-powered chainsaw, just a lot slower and a lot weaker, and it's a lot easier to handle for somebody who has a compromised health. I've always had tremors since I was a child. I've had connective tissue issues. I've had muscle issues. And I've got joint issues, and I just know that when I'm using this thing, it's shaking around, and with a gas-powered chainsaw, that's not a good thing. With this, I don't see myself getting much more than a cut, but with a chainsaw, you can actually lose a limb. So I highly recommend these for anybody that isn't like in some kind of industry where they need a chainsaw. This is very good for a householder. I don't necessarily recommend the brand because these are extremely expensive and they're no better than any others. It was a gift. You can go to most places like Lowe's and Home Depot, and they sell battery-powered chainsaws, and they even sell really, really big ones with really huge batteries, and they will do a lot of cutting, more than you'll ever need if you're just a homeowner. First thing we're going to do is we're going to cut it with a chainsaw, and I'll cut it up a little bit high because I want to be able to show you what this does, but I also want to be able to fix the damage I'm about to do. All right, now that we've removed that limb, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the difference in the cuts made by different cutting tools. The first one we're going to look at is the cut that we just made with the chainsaw. And as you can see, there's a lot of ridges that are visible even with this this photograph, but also a lot of broken plant fibers. It looks like hairs when you rub your hand across it. Now we're going to take a look at the damage done by a regular hand saw. It's still
leaving ridges, and obviously the tree is not going to like getting cut, but much better than the effect of the chainsaw. With loppers, which are your best bet, you get a really, really smooth cut. And even though the tree doesn't like getting cut, I think if you've got to cut it, then this is your best option.
You might notice there's hardly any leaves on this tree, and the reason for that is that the tree is going dormant because it's fall. And I don't know, I haven't read this anywhere, so it may or may not be true, but I always try to do my pruning after a tree goes dormant. It's like doing surgery on a person while they're asleep as opposed to while they're awake. And I don't know that the tree feels anything, but I know it seems to recover better in the spring when it's time for the tree to come back to life. But as you can see, I'm cutting this off in bits and pieces, you know, instead of cutting it in one big piece and dragging it to a fire pile. This area is subject to erosion, and the only solution is to bring in dirt. And rather than do that, we'll just cut these limbs and let them fall here and turn into dirt. So a whole lot easier. If you notice, I'm not giving a whole lot of instructions because it's pretty much self-explanatory when you start doing it. But one of the things that you need to know, like and this is just for fig trees, not every tree is exactly the same, but they all work about the same. All these little lumps on here are potential leaves and limbs. So you just have to have that in mind when you're cutting this stuff off, that wherever you cut it off, the first nodules after that are going to put out leaves and limbs. And I don't like limbs that grow upside down or sideways. So as I'm cutting, I'm trying to imagine what this is going to look like when the limbs grow. I don't know which camera angle can see, but this has been cut off before. Let me see if I can get this camera around there. Yeah. That right there has been cut off before. All the limbs that are growing beneath that were not there when I did that pruning. Now you can look and see they're reaching up above the roof. So you know this is kind of like a haircut. You know, when you're done, no matter how bad it looks, it's gonna grow back. This one's way over its limit. Very fortunate that I'm doing this on a fig tree. Fig trees are very soft. They're very soft compared to other trees. Like a hickory tree, you probably couldn't even do this. I know this looks bad, but I'm not going to leave it like this. I'm cutting this. I'll cut this off right about here. Now I got to bend over because I cut that one off without trimming it first. Of course, when you're doing this, you always make a point of cutting anything off that looks dead. You don't want dead stuff, no matter what. Like this time of year, this time around, I'm cutting this thing a little lower, right here than I cut it last year or the year before. I know this looks really bad, but about 6 to 8 weeks ago, maybe, I pruned the fig trees on the front of the house and the other side of the house, and because it wasn't really they weren't dormant yet, they've already started to recover. I think pretty much any tree will recover from a pruning that's this dramatic, but I wouldn't recommend doing anything this dramatic on other trees. Figs have a really, really good reputation for snapping back. So we'll go take a look at that right now. Yeah, here's the front door to my house. The first tree that I pruned is the one right there to the right of my front door, and going down the side of the house, there's three right there. That's the third one. Go around the corner, and there's a fourth one, and all of these are growing back. Now these on this side of the house actually look a lot more scraggly, but that's because they're taller. The house is elevated over here, so even though I was still using the handrail, which is actually the bracing for the screen, the studs on my screen porch, those trees are actually taller because that side of the house is taller. Here's a close-up view of a limb that I pruned with a chainsaw about 6 to 8 weeks ago, and that's how bad that looks. Around it you see leaves, but the leaves are not growing off of the woody part of this tree. Actual little limbs are growing out of the woody part, and the leaves are growing off of those little limbs. That limb right there can get like 6 feet long, and it's just a guess, but it's about 6 feet long over the course of a summer. Now down here, we can get a look at a limb that I pruned off 2 years ago. As you can see, it's starting to actually heal over the pruning. It'll never actually cover that all the way up, but you can see that it's doing quite well. With the pruning of our fig trees completed and the limbs on the ground, this is what we have left. Now, upon closer inspection, we can see that I have, in fact, cut the limbs into smaller pieces, and there's a reason for that. If we simply throw the limbs out without cutting them up, then the majority of the wood will be suspended in the air. That's good if you want to dry limbs, but we don't want to dry our limbs. We want to compost our limbs. Cutting them into smaller pieces allows the limbs to be directly in contact with the ground, which is much better for composting. Since the subject of this video is maintaining our fruit trees at a manageable size, I think it's appropriate that we discuss what a manageable size might be. We're not going to plant our fruit trees in a space large enough to accommodate the fruit tree on the day that we plant it. We have to think ahead about what size the tree will eventually grow to as it reaches maturity. And we're going to make sure that we don't just plant enough space for the tree, but that we leave enough space for a person to get around the tree to pick the fruit. Now, if you plant up against a structure such as a fence or a house, once that tree presses tightly against that house, you're not going to be able to get on the side of the tree that's facing the house to pick the fruit. Another thing we need to take into consideration if we're planting next to another tree is how big that other tree will get as it reaches maturity. Because once those two trees grow together, you're still not going to be able to pick the fruit from the tree that's fruit tree. And if both trees are fruit trees, we're going to lose production off of both trees. Now, height's not that big of a deal. In general, it doesn't matter how tall a tree grows, because even if it's producing fruit that's out of your reach, it's still producing fruit for somebody. Other animals are natural climbers or flyers, and they'll take care of the fruit that you can't get to. Now we're going to take a look at two different trees and the effect that the surroundings have had on these trees. Neither tree is a fruit tree, but they are both of the same species and variety. These are live oaks. Live oaks have a reputation for being very, very wide while not being very tall. But I don't think that's true in every case, because on my property I have many, many live oaks. This particular live oak is very wide, about 150 feet across, while only 100 feet tall. I say only because this tree is probably about 300 years old. 100 feet is not very tall for a 300-year-old tree. Now the next tree that we're looking at is nowhere near as old, maybe only 50 to 100 years old, and yet it is about 120 feet tall without being very wide at all. The first tree probably sprouted in an open field. When the second tree sprouted, it was probably surrounded by other large trees, meaning that the first tree did not have to grow straight up in order to reach the sun, while the second tree probably did. And as you can see, it is very, very tall, but not very wide.
The two trees that we're going to look at now actually are fruit trees. In fact, they are loquats, also known as Japanese plums. This first tree that we're looking at is relatively short and wide because I planted it in what at the time was the middle of my lawn. This tree is probably only 12 feet tall, even though it is about 8 years old. The tree that we're looking at now is relatively tall and yet quite thin. This tree was planted only about 4 years ago, and yet it is 16 feet tall because I planted it in what at the time was the middle of the woods. I have since cleared out quite a few of the trees that surround this tall, thin tree and will continue to do so. It is very unlikely that this tree will ever get much taller than it is right now once I clear away the trees that are blocking the sun. We often associate trees with height, and in fact, many trees can, over time, get very, very tall. Earlier, we spoke about how humans have manipulated trees in order to create what are called dwarf trees. But if you compare the different kinds of trees to one another, you'll often find that fruit trees are relatively small. In the natural world, trees that are very, very tall are called canopy trees because they form the canopy or protection of the forest. So smaller trees, which are not able to take direct sunlight or other weather phenomenon, are often found beneath these canopy trees. These trees are known as understory trees because they live under the canopy produced by the canopy trees. Fruit trees, compared to most trees, are extremely small, even in standard sizes. So in general, there's no reason to purchase a dwarf fruit tree because full-size fruit trees are actually dwarfs when compared to other trees. Just to give you a clear understanding of the difference between the size of what we normally think of as a tree and the size of a standard fruit tree, we're going to take a look at some pictures. This is an ash tree. This ash tree is approximately 200 years old. Now this next tree is a sycamore tree. This sycamore tree also is about 200 years old. The tree you're looking at now is an orange tree. In fact, it's the first orange tree planted in the United States of America. This orange tree also is about 200 years old. And yes, that really is a white picket fence around it, and those really are oranges on that tree. That is the size of an orange tree after it's been growing for 200 years. This next picture is of another famous tree. This is the Endicott pear, which is also a fruit tree. This photograph was taken about 150 years ago. The next picture is the same Endicott pear, and this photograph was taken in the 1920s. This is the Endicott pear today. This pear tree is approximately 400 years old. Since we understand the concept of growth over time, and we understand that we do not space our trees according to the size that they are on the day we purchase them, but rather on the size that they will reach at maturity, then we need to understand that that isn't really always the case. Human beings, in general, only live to be about 70 or 80 years old. I find that a lot of my subscribers are my age, which means that you really only have to worry about how big your trees are going to get over the course of the next 20 or 30 years. Because after that, it's really not your problem. But even then, it's not that big of a deal. You can space your fruit trees as close together as you want,
But you have to understand when you're planting them that the day will come when you have to cut down half of your fruit trees. And in fact, this is the way professional pecan growers actually do business. They know that pecan trees require 50 feet of space between one another, but they do have to be close enough to pollinate one another, because pecan trees, unlike many other trees, are wind pollinated. In other words, there are no insects or birds to do the pollination work. They have to be in close proximity to one another. So pecan growers will actually plant their pecans, according to variety, in a pattern that places the pecan trees 25 feet apart. Then, once the pecan trees reach about 50 years of age and become too crowded, they go in and they cut down every other tree. And this is the patterns they use to plant these trees, put the varieties that are necessary to pollinate one another in a pattern that works when they are spaced 25 feet apart, but knowingly put them in a pattern that will work once half of the trees are cut down.
We're now going to take a look at 3 actual orchard thinning plans. This first thinning plan was specifically designed for a pecan orchard and takes into account the fact that pecans require wind pollination, as well as taking into account the growth rate of pecan trees. This thinning plan only accounts for 1 thinning cycle. This next thinning plan is for orchards which will require over the course of their life 2 thinnings. The final thinning plan that we are looking at would represent a very specific orchard. There are small circles representing small trees or small varieties of trees. There are large circles representing large trees or large varieties of trees. There are empty spaces representing trees which have already been removed, and there are black spaces representing trees which need to be removed. I'm not showing you this to suggest that you should plant your permaculture forest in a grid pattern. I'm simply making the point that whenever we plant a tree, we have to have in our mind that it may one day need to be sacrificed for the overall health of the forest. Also, we need to keep in mind that any new trees that we plant may one day require us to cut down or remove the surrounding trees. When it comes to size, all trees are not created equal, and that's true also of growth rate. This particular tree isn't even really a tree. It's a banana tree. As far as I'm concerned, banana trees are more like a vegetable than a tree, because when you cut them down, you can't use the trunks for lumber or anything. They just rots into mush really, really quick. And in fact, I have to cut it down every year, because as soon as it gets a little cold, and I don't mean freezing, maybe around 41 degrees, this thing dies. And so the amount of growth that you see there is actually accomplished over a single growing season. Of course, it didn't start off this tall. It took a few years to get this high, but I don't think it's ever going to get any higher. Now, right behind that tree, or in front of the tree, is a fig. And you can see me with my hand on the fig tree. Also, you can see the leaves of the fig tree above the banana tree. And that fig tree is probably about 5 years old. And the only reason I use it as a to show you how tall a fig tree will get is because every other fig tree I have has been pruned this year, or at least at some time in its life. This one has never been pruned as far as I know. So this is what you can expect from a fig tree in about 5 years, and that's actual 5 years from putting a cutting into some soil to the time that you get a tree like this. Now this tree is a mulberry tree, and mulberries kind of grow wild now. I don't know that they were started here, but they have naturalized to the southeastern United States. This one is probably about 10 feet tall, and it's probably about 5 years old altogether from the time somebody somewhere started it to the time it is now. The next tree is a Japanese persimmon. I have quite a few of these. I think, 25 or 50 Japanese persimmons altogether. This one is about 5 years old. And this one is about 20 years old. And this is about as big as they get. I've never seen a Japanese persimmon any bigger than this. So if you're planning on growing some, you need about however much space that tree right there will take up. Here I am standing next to another Japanese persimmon that is probably about 7 years old, and I've actually purchased the one I'm standing next to at the same time that I purchased the one behind me. So they're both 7 years old, but the one behind me died, and what came back was the rootstock. So even though the front is a Japanese persimmon, the one behind me is an American or native persimmon. They get a lot bigger than the Japanese version. Here I am standing next to a pear tree, and I know that this area was deep in the woods before the hurricane, and it wasn't until after the hurricane that the Corps of Engineers came and cleared this piece of property of all the fallen trees, and I was able to plant these pears. But I would say that these pears are probably about 9 years old, and not just the one I'm standing next to there, but even this one. So these are both pears, or two different varieties of pears. They may be in a little bit different soil. This one at 9 years old is actually probably in excess of 20 feet tall, or at least close to 20 feet tall. Here I am standing next to an orange tree. This orange tree is out in the woods, which wasn't cleared before Katrina, and it actually took me quite a while after Katrina. This tree has probably been here about 5 years. If it was 2 years old when I purchased it, that would make it about a 7-year-old orange tree. And here we are with another fruit tree that's not really a tree. It's actually considered a shrub. This is a pineapple guava, and I don't know exactly how old this is, but I would say between 5 and 10 years old, and it's a little bit above my hand. I just got the hand over it so you can tell which tree I'm talking about. This tree is a mayhaw. If you're familiar with hawthorns, a mayhaw is actually a May hawthorn. It's kind of like a swamp version of a hawthorn. It produces something like a crab apple. People make jelly out of it. And this tree is probably about 10 years old. And here I am standing next to a pecan tree, and this pecan tree is actually planted after the hurricane. And all total, from the time it was planted as a seed and then grafted into where it is today, is less than 10 years old. I would say about 8 years old. This is another nut tree. This is a Chinese chestnut, and it's probably about maybe 4 years old. I dug it up off of a shoot about 75 miles north of here, and of course the first year it didn't grow at all because when you transplant something, it takes a year for it to recover. This is actually an oak tree, a live oak, and I am familiar with an oak tree near here called the friendship oak that they say is about 525 years old. They counted the rings by coring it, which is, drilling a little hole all the way through the tree and pulling the core out and counting the rings. This one's about half the size of that tree. So if the other one really is 525 years old, and this is about half that. So we're thinking 262 and a half years. And this is another shade tree. Doesn't actually produce any food for me. It's a weeping willow that I cut a limb off of a weeping willow and stuck it in the ground about 1 year ago. This tree is over 9 feet tall in just 1 year. This is another shade tree. This is a popcorn tree. I can't think right off the top of my head what the official Latin name of it is or whatever, but it's a popcorn tree, and this tree is really only about maybe 4 years old, maybe 3 years old. And you can see it's in excess of 20 feet. These pine trees are, I'm standing behind that, so the one in the foreground looks a little bigger than it actually is. But these pine trees are about 3 years old because I cut around them for the first time maybe 2 years ago. I saw them growing up in my lawn. I made a point of not killing them. So we're talking about 3 years, and this pine tree is already this big. This is a loblolly pine. I think the three kind of pines that grow down here, the short leaf, long leaf, and loblollies. I really believe that's a loblolly, and so are the other two. And here we are with a black gum or sweet gum, and it's not doing too good, but this is probably about a 50-year-old tree. I didn't plant this tree. I wasn't here when the tree was planted. I'm only guessing because I have planted some hardwoods in the past that are way, way, way bigger than this. Over at my mom's house. So I'm pretty sure that's about a 50-year-old tree. It could be a 100-year-old, and it could be 25 years old. I really don't know. But it takes a long time for a tree to get that big. You don't have to worry about planting something like that. And that's the theory here. If you notice, this cypress tree is right next to my house. I just planted this cypress tree maybe 2 years ago, but it was pretty good size when I got it. It's probably 4 years old altogether, but they do grow rather quickly. This one, this is another cypress tree, and you might think, why in the world would anybody plant something like that right next to their house? Well, this tree is 1,500 years old, so I guess I can count on having problems with my tree breaking the slab in about 700 years. Not really my problem. I hope that you enjoyed the information that I just shared with you in this video, and I also hope that you recognize the significance of this information. When I first became interested in permaculture, I read every book about the subject that I could get my hands on, because the internet simply was not available at that time. But much of the information I read was so technical and so confusing that it often left me feeling as if the only person on this planet qualified to plant a tree would be a state-certified tree scientist. But that's not at all true. In fact, if every human on this planet were to simply leave for about 1,000 years and come back, I'm pretty sure that they would find that the earth had converted itself into a permaculture forest without any intervention from humans whatsoever. But with human intervention, we could actually get this accomplished much sooner. Initially, I did not set out to produce a permaculture video, much less a permaculture video series. This video is a small part of what was supposed to be a very simple response to a very simple Bible question posted by one of my viewers. He wrote, "I wondered if you might be kind enough to do a video about what it is that people are supposed to be doing with the earth in regard to being caretakers of the earth. I have enjoyed your tours of your property and backwoods. I presume that one of the primary functions of people is to enjoy nature, as I believe the American Indians did. Or are there any specifics on gardening, growing food, and tending the habitation that we've been given? I realize that this may be a hard topic to address, but I get the impression that we are to enjoy nurture and tend and care for the earth, but do not completely understand if there are any specifics on how we are to do that. If you have any thoughts about that subject, please share them." Believe it or not, the Bible has a whole lot of information about what humans are supposed to be doing with regard to the earth. But it's not as technical as what I was putting in this video. So I felt like it was probably a good idea to make this video separate from any video response I do to that scriptural question. However, there is an incredible amount of information in the Bible that I will be discussing once I respond to that question in my next upcoming video. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.